Welcome, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get things started. I know we still have folks signing on, but we've got a rich conversation in front of us and a lot to get through, so I want to be respectful of time. My name is Angelique Young, and I lead the Truman National Security Project. I am so grateful to you for joining us here today. Just briefly about Truman, our mission is pretty simple. We bring people together who care deeply about democracy and security, and we help them think clearly and act responsibly, especially when the stakes are really high. And so we're here today to create space for serious, informed conversations that are grounded in experience, in law, and in values, and to support a community that believes protecting democracy is inseparable from national security. So today's conversation about Venezuela takes place through the lens of that commitment. And with that, again, thanks for coming. And I am pleased to turn it over to our moderator for this conversation today, Jordan Kane, to get us started. Jordan, thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Angelique. I wanted to start by grounding this conversation in the fact that this is intended to be a three-part series of conversations, so please stay tuned for announcements about more. But for this particular conversation, we're going to be focusing on intervention and its aftermath. Basically, what have we learned from decades of US and international interventions, and what can that tell us about what we might expect to see next in Venezuela? What have past US and international nation building efforts actually achieved? Are records more mixed than we would like it to be? When has external intervention helped stabilize states, and when has it made conditions worse? What conditions might be necessary for sustainable governance after regime change? And how do resource-rich environments, particularly oil, complicate reconstruction, accountability, and legitimacy? But before we get into the substance of that, why don't we go around the room and do a round of lightning intros? These folks have experience and expertise that is too long for us to do justice to, so I'd encourage everybody to go look at the bios included in the event invitation. But for now, if you don't mind, give me your name and then tell us about one role or region or problem set that you have experience with that's relevant to this conversation. And I will have you start with Ambassador Johnson.
Hi, I'm David Johnson, and relevant to this, I am a former Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, which put me pretty deeply into both Iraq and Afghanistan.
And Amanda.
Hi, I'm Amanda Mattingly. Among some of the roles I've had, I worked at the U.S. Department of State in the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, and included among my assignments was at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas in the 2000s.
Joe.
Hello, everybody. My name is Joe McSpedden, and I worked for a bunch of years in the Office of Transition Initiatives at USAID, including as a country representative on Venezuela and the programming down there.
David.
Hi, I'm David Mandel Anthony. I was the Deputy Ambassador at the State Department for Global Criminal Justice. I worked on fragile states and transitional justice and political transitions around the world, including in Latin America.
Justin.
Hi there, Justin Richmond. I've been running a Muddy Boots NGO since 2015 here in DC called Impel Project. A lot of reps in conflict and stabilization environments for the past 2 years. Been running a stealth startup focused on the critical mineral and fishery space, which is why we're interested in Venezuela. So really happy to be on the panel.
Great to have all of you. All right. Amanda, based on your work in Venezuela and across the region, how do you assess the actual goals of the current U.S. approach? These are often framed less around democratic transformation and more around stability and alignment with U.S. interests. How do you see these goals interacting with Venezuela's political culture and the lived realities on the ground?
Thanks, Jordan, and thanks, everybody. I am really excited about this conversation. So I wanted to start by kind of rewinding back in history and telling you all about. So when I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Caracas, and then for many years after that, I just can't tell you the number of members of the Venezuelan opposition who asked me, when is the U.S. government going to intervene? When are you going to come in and oust our president? These were Venezuelan opposition figures who just hated Hugo Chavez and hated his handpicked successor, Nicolas Maduro. And so I think it's interesting as we start this conversation to think about the answer at that time was, look, the problems of Venezuela cannot be solved by external actors, that internal problems to Venezuela couldn't be solved by the United States, and that we promoted a democratic transition that Venezuelans could get to on their own in a legitimate path forward to free and fair elections and back to a more open market-based economy. Now, listen, at the time, that was a really hard message for people to hear. I want to stress that for those of the Venezuelan opposition who were living in a time of increasingly autocratic government of Chavez and then Maduro. This was they were enduring political persecution. The government was grossly mismanaging the economy, hyperinflation, sham elections, corruption, and all of this resulting in nearly 8 million Venezuelans who fled their country since 2014. This is the largest humanitarian crisis in Latin America. I think that's really important to underscore. So, okay, we fast forward now to January 3rd, 2026, and the US government answers those pleas of the Venezuelan opposition for all these years, right? And we go in and the US government ousts Nicolas Maduro. And the Venezuelan opposition, and I think it's also worth saying many people in the region celebrated, right? And were very happy in the morning of January 3rd that Maduro was extracted. But pretty quickly, they realized, and I think we all have seen, that the opposition in Venezuela has been sidelined and that the US government has cut a deal with the existing government, just minus Nicolas Maduro. So I think this leads to really important questions about legitimacy and what our goals are there. I think that what we've seen is basically a transition from an anti-American dictatorship to now a more forced pro-American one that is open to American economic interests, namely oil and gas. So not democracy, not human rights, and actually not even really narco-terrorism, which was the pretext for going in. Those don't seem to be the real objectives right now. And even right after the extraction of Maduro, President Trump said pretty quickly that the Venezuelan opposition leader and Nobel laureate Maria Corina Machado didn't have the support or respect in Venezuela to lead. And so then also you hear from Secretary of State Marco Rubio and others in the Trump administration working with Maduro's vice president, who is now the interim president, Delcy Rodriguez. And so I think it's pretty clear that it's still we took out the dictator, but we left the dictator's henchmen and all its security apparatus. And I think that it's we can't confuse that with some kind of democratic transition. And I think that, maybe this will work in the short term, but over the long term, I think it raises some really important questions about legitimacy on the ground for both sides, those who supported, Chavismo, and then those in the Venezuelan opposition in particular. I think it's really interesting that last week, the National Assembly in Venezuela was very astonishingly quick to change the hydrocarbons law to allow for foreign investment in the oil and gas sector. But did they lay out a roadmap for elections? No, they didn't. So, Delcy herself, I think, is trying to legitimize herself in the eyes of the Venezuelan people. She's done a couple of things that I'm really happy to see for sure. Releasing political prisoners, that's really important. She's introduced she's proposed a new amnesty law. We'll see what that looks like. So there are steps perhaps, but this is my view, until we see a real political transition on the ground in Venezuela, that I just don't see that Venezuela has the legitimacy, that this government has the legitimacy to move forward, to stave off internal conflict, to stave off an insurgency, to guarantee securities for, companies that might want to invest, including oil and gas companies. And of course, I just don't see that they have the legitimacy to build a sustainable, economically viable, democratic Venezuela.
That feels like a really nice place to transition over to Joe. Joe, if stability and a pro-US orientation are the implicit objectives, how does oil complicate that calculus, both in terms of internal power consolidation and the leverage that external actors think that they have, but often don't?
Yeah, thanks, Jordan, for that, and thank you, Amanda, for the start. And hello, everybody. It's nice to talk to you today. I think, I mean, rather than an implicit goal, it's been a pretty fairly explicit goal stated so far by the U.S. government in terms of accessing and being able to take advantage of the resources that Venezuela has to create a more positive transition. I think the initial focus being on a more positive transition from the perspective of the United States, and then also with this three-staged approach that we've heard about, something that benefits the Venezuelan people as well. I think it's important, Amanda did a little bit of a history lesson. I mean, it's no shock the centrality of oil in Venezuela over the last 70 years has played a humongous role in what we've seen in their geopolitics and the approach that they've had. It was oil wealth that made Venezuela the envy of Latin America in terms of infrastructure in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It was an attempt to appease international financiers that led to the 1989 Caracazo, which was a riot related to a raise in gas prices and their effect also on local transportation, which radicalized a young Hugo Chavez, a member of the military at the time, and eventually led him to be president. It was oil during Chavez's regime and later under Maduro that allowed them to both build, to create a coalition within Venezuela of support, mainly via the distribution of wealth, the selective and intentional distribution of oil wealth that came through the missions and other programs that they had, and then also allowed them to create, honestly, their entire foreign policy, right? And their influence around the world. Venezuela had an outsized influence on a lot of issues, especially those that were concerning to the United States, that was all based on their ability to use oil for diplomacy. So, I mean, I think the key thing here is to understand the core aspect of this for Venezuela, not pro Chavez or against, not opposition. I mean, essentially, oil is part of the Venezuelan identity as a nation and is incredibly important. And I think the sovereignty over that is something that is going to continue to be a question as they expand. Now, it's no surprise that the hydrocarbon law, which essentially, is a fundamental rejection of the last 20 years or so of governance, was one of the first things they passed here, given the stated interests on the U.S. side. But it is a big deal. And I think, the main way where we might see this play out, I'm not gonna, I don't know any of the insider details, but the process and on how that oil money will be, beneficial to the Venezuelan people seems very vague at this point. If you saw the Treasury Secretary's testimony yesterday, where he was asked specifically about authorities under which the Treasury would manage this money from sale of Venezuelan oil, it was clear, at least in my mind, that there wasn't a lot of deep thought put into what that would look like. The other part of this is there seems to be a lack of really any effort so far to integrate the Venezuelan people into the decisions that are going to be made on how that wealth is spent. And I think, that lack of potential transparency and that lack of, an objective use of these funds for the benefit of Venezuelans, I think may lead to complications down the road. I think it's possible, given this approach, in my opinion, the best way to go about it would be as transparent as possible with the Venezuelan people and look for ways to integrate them into this process. You saw also in Venezuela, the National Assembly met with the opposition yesterday as they publicized it. It was not many members of the actual or what would be considered the majority of the opposition. And so I think you've got a real concern aligned with what Amanda brought up here, that this current regime would continue to play favorites with that wealth and how it was distributed. So I'll stop there.
Jordan, you're on mute.
I'm just talking to myself. I was saying I wanted to pull on a thread that you just touched on. To what degree is the Venezuelan opposition unified, or has this been a unifying or a divisive? Has it been divisive for them to respond in different ways to the intervention?
If you're asking me, I think that historically, this has been a very diverse opposition that has a lot of different viewpoints on the best way forward and various levels of integration and support with U.S. foreign policy. I think, it's interesting that, the U.S. there have been a bunch of articles lately that the U.S. did not just communicate with the Rodriguezes prior to this. They also communicated extensively with the Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello. He is another actor who I think has a very strong set of opinions about how this should go, and certainly has integrated himself through the security services and the colectivos, these informal organizations that have access to weapons in communities throughout Venezuela. It's gonna be interesting to see how all those different forces and those within, as the opposition sort of expands, here we've got a new reality. So you've got folks who wouldn't have traditionally been part of the opposition who will be looking for a role in this moving forward, seeing how that sort of works as a process. I would say, to answer your question, it is not an incredibly I'm the right word there. I'm not sure what I'm looking for, but they're not totally aligned across the opposition. And I think there are a number of actors who are looking for a seat at the table. It's been a long 20 plus years of opposition for a lot of these folks. And so there have been a lot of actors who've stepped up in that role and who might be looking for a place now.
Thank you. Let's see. David Mandel Anthony, I've got to specify because we've got two Davids here. In systems shaped by resource wealth and external pressure in resource-rich countries like Venezuela, which accountability mechanisms tend to erode first? And what does that tell about what does that tell us about why externally driven transitions often stall or distort rather than stabilize?
Thanks, and it's a pleasure to be here with everyone and to have this discussion with everyone today. I was thinking a lot about resource-rich comparators, and part of the issue in finding a good comparison for Venezuela is just that the internal armed conflicts in other resource-rich countries like DRC or Sudan, it's always a kind of a chicken and egg as to which one has come first. And right now, we have to just have the starting point that there are no accountability mechanisms in Venezuela that have any credibility or legitimacy, and that the state of the hollowed out institutions and the lack of a coherent sort of government that is not just a parasitic narco criminal organization means that we are essentially starting from scratch. And so this goes back to all of the other legitimacy issues that Amanda, I think, so cogently raised. If I were to talk about, let's say, Sudan, one thing that might be interesting and relevant is the failure of the Biden administration comes to mind, that we were able to name atrocities being committed, but we were not able to name the key enablers of those atrocities that were connected to resource extraction regimes. So, for example, it's all good and well to describe human rights violations and repression, but if we don't name the external enablers or the internal structures that create those conditions, then we're failing to address the problem. And I think Amanda's remarks lead us to a similar kind of analysis here, where if we just swap out the head of a repressive criminal regime without getting under the hood and analyzing the structures of oppression, then we're not able to adequately sort of achieve even the narrow transactional goal of US foreign policy, which is essentially resource extraction with a consolidated authoritarian regime. In South Sudan, I think, and even to some extent the DRC, you have a real cautionary tale of if things completely and utterly fall apart, in part because of this, cycle of resource rents and fragmented armed networks, chronic instability, weak foreign investment, the cycle, there are some very bleak potential scenarios facing Venezuela that are provided by other essentially failed states. And I think I'll just end on this, that, if the transactional approach of this administration premised on, oil and gas rents and strategic sanctions workarounds, if those sustain the coercive networks and repression and criminality continue as an embedded problem, it's not just a sequencing choice that can be postponed. So Rubio, in his testimony, almost seemed to posit that no, we're going to try and avoid all the messiness of external interventions that have bedeviled the US across the last 25 years. We're just avoiding all of this messy work of transitions. And right now we're focused on stability for the service of extractive benefit to the United States. And I guess my realist's argument to that, and I'm not even going to ground it in a sort of moral argument. My realist argument is that that approach really does not correctly assess the risks of an externally imposed transition that has no legitimacy, because it can't be postponed. It's going to bedevil any mission set from day one.
It does feel like the outset of these things is always, this is going to be light touch. We're not going to have to do much. It's going to take care of itself. But I think Ambassador Johnson had a comment.
So expertise, if you will, in this is having worked in a lot of post-conflict and post-intervention situations. And one thing that they tend to have in common, even a terrorist incident like the one in London in 2005, is that for a period of time after that, generally 6, maybe if you're lucky 9 months, people just kind of go to ground. And it is a misleading honeymoon period where you think what you have done has resulted in the objective that you were seeking. But that's actually the period of time you have to get started building institutions, resolving internal conflicts, getting a society ready to govern itself. And it'll start to show up when dispute resolution breaks down and people start settling scores among themselves. And it tends to start small. You won't have a giant insurgency on your hand, in 45 days. It'll start with organized crime becoming more and more embedded, with people just, blood feuds breaking out among people who have neighborhood disputes, things like that. And it's really important to bear in mind that you can't draw conclusions from what's going on right now. The administration may be extraordinarily lucky and everything turn out just ducky, but they have a high risk of this turning into a giant sucking chest wound for the United States and the Caribbean. And that's the real risk. My colleagues here have been talking about human rights and democracy, and those are really important things. But from the US government's point of view, the most important thing is a stable Venezuela that does not export its people and does not export a lot of instability to the region and have a general breakdown in their society. That they're just too close to us for that not to affect us in some very serious ways.
Justin, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the honeymoon period and your experience with that in other countries.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. When a vacuum is created within these types of communities, regions, countries, and whether it's a war, whether it's the removal of a political leader, it can be a typhoon as well. That vacuum, it's really hard to understand what the effects are going to be. They do play out exactly as the ambassador said, in about 6 to 9 months. And quite frankly, if you do not set up, and from my angle, what I would argue is the data feedback loops to understand how these communities and these critical sectors are responding to this disturbance, it's going to be a mess, because what happens is the incentivized actors fill that space. And if you don't know who they are and what those incentives are, it could easily fail. So I think, as everyone is speaking rightly, this is a more transactional administration. Venezuela will start with gas and oil, will very quickly lead into the critical minerals, and then the fisheries will be at play. I think those are the 3 places this is going to go.
Ambassador Johnson, I wonder if you could talk about what the risks are to the administration after that honeymoon period. If you were working on this issue, what would you be most concerned about, given the strategy that we've seen to date?
I would be most concerned about the breakdown of security and what that might mean for the ultimate political stability of the country. The security is the single ingredient that you've got to have in order to do everything else. And so the absence of any plan, as far as can be determined, to turn the current security setup from one which really doesn't have much support among the population to one that does is really important. When you think about security, you need to think about two different things. One is an army or military, which protects the state, and the other is a police service, which protects the public. And those are two different things. They're trained in two different ways. I'm not worried about an external intervention from Colombia and Venezuela, so I wouldn't be terribly concerned about building up their military. But I'd be really concerned about figuring out how to develop a police service, a prosecution service, courts, all of those things which are required to resolve disputes among the public with each other, and which, if they're not addressed, tend to lead to the breakdown of a political order in pretty short, in a pretty short time space. So I think that if I were there, I would be, if you will, jumping up and down, trying to figure out how to get this process started rather than waiting until it starts, the evidence of its unraveling becomes so apparent that you're so deep in a hole you may never get out of it.
I agree with that. I think we also often see a heavy-handed securitized approach to the uprising. I wonder, Joe, if you could speak to first why security first approaches are popular in the moment the ambassador was describing 9 months in, and also why they tend to be unsuccessful if used in isolation.
Yeah, I think, and just quickly to jump, I mean, the ambassador said it there, right? In the absence of security, a lot of the other things we're discussing in a transition just can't take place. And so it has to be a core central part of the approach post the transition. Now, the interesting part of this one is that all of those actors the ambassador mentioned there in terms of the courts, the police, they still exist. These are the same actors who were there prior to the transition at the top. And so I think fundamentally you're going to be looking at a different aspect because they are not perceived as legitimate by a lot of the population, and they are perceived as legitimate by some. I don't think there are any who think they're objective and applying the law equally for all Venezuelans, but there are those who think that it's working in their favor and those that are not. I think it's really, really key on that to try to figure out what the nitty-gritty on some of these things we're hearing as we move forward, right? So the proposed law on amnesty, the human rights organizations in Venezuela have responded on that. And they've responded, this is a great start. Now let's build a process to discuss and create a law that really allows for the amnesty we're talking about, but doesn't protect the people who have committed violations of human rights of Venezuelan citizens, right? And that's one of the worries when you've got all of the people who were involved in that are still in power. What is their interest going to be incentivized, as Justin mentioned, to do as part of that amnesty? It's going to be to protect themselves. And so I think, in this case, the security aspect is complex. David Alt mentioned, this is a rampant criminality is a problem in Venezuela. Selective application of justice is a very, very big problem in Venezuela. The informal actors like the colectivos are right now a bit of a wild card. I mean, in the initial response, you saw checkpoints being set up and you heard stories of colectivos who were checking for your cell phone to see if you wrote a message about the event and everything else. That has calmed down somewhat on the ground, but those are a perfect storm of potential bad actors for spoiling a transition, right? You've got armed folks with experience in key neighborhoods, who have a lot of deniability with some of the actors who are still at the top in terms of what they do and why they do it. And so I think, that's something that will be a core aspect of this. Just in mentioning the military, the military, Venezuela has had a complex relationship, the military and internal security services, the presence of many Cubans and a Cuban model for repressing local activism and opposition is something that's sort of bled over across those institutions. So when the ambassador mentions that, it's something where you might potentially be looking at ways to separate them. Again, writ large, the military is more respected than those other internal security institutions, but it's not without, I think, complaints there. And then ultimately, in terms of support, you've got to make sure on the security side that it's not it's not selectively focused, right? So if all the security concerns that the United States is pushing on are related to security for extraction of whether it's minerals or oil, then that's one thing that I think will lead to problems on the ground. I think it can't contradict, the lived reality of Venezuelans. I think there's got to be some aspect of the security here that's also about justice and about reconciliation ultimately, that I think all of that needs to play in. And then, it needs to, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, right? This isn't security, but I mentioned Cabello. His daughter was just named by Rodriguez as the new head of tourism for Venezuela. And so why did she do that, right? These factions are sort of sorting out their roles vis-a-vis one another, and you don't want security to be perceived as a tool they're using to either to solve their problems or to go after past grudges. Yesterday, and it's Venezuela, right? So we're not sure, but two businessmen who were the money men for Maduro were arrested supposedly in a joint operation with the FBI, which is a fascinating thing to hear would be happening on the ground in Venezuela. At the same time, the lawyer for one of them said he's not arrested. He's calmly living his life here in Caracas. So we'll see what comes of that. But there are some aspects of that look like score settling that I think will be important for the United States to navigate as it moves forward on the security side.
David Mandel Anthony, jump in there.
Yeah, and the ambassador rang the bell on security, and very quickly, justice and accountability showed up to the party. And that's where I would start, is that with a strategic proposition, that is, transitions that fail to reduce impunity reproduce instability risks. That's not a moral proposition, that's a strategic proposition. And I think even though we have a narrower set of goals, that lesson is still incredibly relevant for policymakers. The question is, and I think Justin was alluding to this, the question is how to reframe this lesson in ways that align with the administration's objectives, right? The lessons that we know about how impunity breeds instability, and you cannot have the end state that is desired without addressing some of these issues. I mean, to put it in stark terms, I don't think it's too much of an overstatement to say that the security forces in Venezuela, their primary function is not to protect the people, but rather their primary function is internal repression for the goal of consolidating regime power. And you could also say that the primary function of the judicial organs is essentially to provide impunity while serving as some sort of pressure valve to address more mundane civil administrative disputes in the population. But these exist, these institutions, as so often happens with regimes that commit mass atrocities, their functions have been entirely inverted. And so if we are going to take serious the claim that security is paramount, then we very quickly have to look at the structures, the judicial, the legal, the accountability structures that have made crimes possible. I'd also say one thing, like a big lesson that I take from having worked on so many transition contexts, is that all transitions are partial. There's always a remnants of the ancien regime that retain power and control. And there's always structures that are not overhauled overnight or that have to be completely rebuilt. The the US has historically done a very bad job of factoring that into our political economy analysis. We like to think that we're starting with a clean slate just because the head is gone or we have a new regime in place. But in Venezuela, that error by the US seems almost categorical. And again, back to my point that the assumption is that just reshuffling leadership and keeping the mafia lets us skip the transition work and just derive the straight transactional benefits. So we need to return to the underappreciated lesson that all transitions are partial, and the question is how do we sort of revamp the institutions and structures that have provided impunity rather than accountability.
I have a question broadly for the group because there's so much former USG expertise in this room. In what ways is the Trump administration limited because so many of the parts of the US government that would historically have been involved in or running this transition, this stabilization effort, have been diminished or not operational? We've cut the parts of USAID and state that focused on exactly this moment. Go ahead, Ambassador Johnson.
So I'd say they're much more limited than they used to be. I don't think it's impossible to, if you will, resurrect some of these capabilities. But to go back to the point that I originally made, you have much less time than you think you do. And the time to, in whatever form, whether if it's a contractor relationship, if it's resurrecting the bureaucracy itself, or whatever you're going to do to help foster this, you need to be started on it yesterday, because the institutional change that you have to foster needs to be underway really, really quickly. So, my real concern is not that it's not possible to, put Humpty Dumpty back together again, so to speak, that it's going to be so late when it's recognized that you do indeed need Humpty Dumpty back on the wall, that it's going to be very hard to do, and it's going to have lots of consequences for the United States that haven't yet been recognized.
Just to ground the conversation, I wonder if there's anyone who can speak to what the US presence in Caracas looks like at the moment. And I'm guessing the implication of what you just said is that there is not a lot of preparation, or that you would intuit that there's not a lot of preparation for what happens in 6 and 9 months.
Well, I can say that our embassy has been closed for a very long time, and we've been running like the Venezuelan embassy out of Bogota for a number of years. I know that there is an effort to get the embassy back up and running quickly. There are FSNs who have worked there for a while, and obviously the Marines, FSNs being foreign service nationals. So that's a start. I think that would be really important. And then perhaps then the AID office that used to work out of the embassy, maybe now via state, would again, get ramped up pretty quickly, like Ambassador Johnson just said, and I'm hopeful that will happen. I think one of the key things will be as we do reopen our embassy in Caracas, that we aren't seen as being one side or the other. I mean, right now we've cut this deal with Delcy, but like, are we now not supporting the opposition? Are we now not going to support democratic transition? To me, I think that's important in terms of our own legitimacy. We're talking about legitimacy on the ground. I think for our own U.S. government legitimacy going forward. And I don't just mean like in the next couple of years, I mean like longer term.
Justin, go ahead.
So, just for context, when it comes to what the US has on the ground, I just got out of Libya with the guy whose company is reopening the Caracas embassy. Right now, it's Venezuelan passport holders only. There is not much of a white side footprint on that yet. I do think the opening of the Caracas embassy is absolutely the right thing to do. I think that, for all the reasons the panelists have said, is the next step. It won't be graceful because the institutions and offices that we need to do this are no longer there. But the embassy is reopening. That's what I.
It reopened earlier this week.
Just on the, on the civil society side, I think we had years of programming there that mostly has stopped over the last couple of years. There may have been some NED programming that continued, but the relationships with a lot of those organizations, these are folks that worked against incredible odds to stay in existence even and operational and not imprisoned over the last 20 years. So these are organizations with strong roots that have a lot of experience previously working with international donors when that was still possible on the ground. And so I think you could start up some of those relationships pretty quickly to get at, Justin made the point, or maybe it was David made the point, if we don't know the right actors and incentives in these deliberations to come over the next 6 to 9 months, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And so you've got folks on the ground who I think you could look to guide any U.S. efforts on that.
Joe, could you provide us with just a brief background as to what kind of engagement USAID was involved in? And particularly, I'd be interested in more recent years.
Yeah, I mean, my direct experience was more in the previous era, but yes, they continued to support civil society in terms of human rights defenders, in terms of media, and in terms of political expression. For a long time, the United States did not provide any support, to the opposition directly. Most of this was to organizations who would be more identified with civil society than with the political opposition. The party institutes, IRI and NDI, both had longstanding programs in Venezuela that were open to work with all political parties, but I don't, at least in my knowledge, I don't know how much they were operating over the last couple of years. So I think some of it was limited on that. And I think even more so over the last couple of years since the U.S. presence on the ground has sort of completely evaporated.
Justin, I wonder if you could talk in a little bit more detail about what the risk curve looks like in the 12 to 24-month period, the second year. As local legitimacy begins to erode, how does the gap between intent and capacity translate into new or insurgent actors? What are you expecting to see?
Oh,
Similar
wow.
question to what I asked.
Yeah,
Dr.
that one's brutal because if you go really cynical, it gets dark very, very fast. As alluded to by David in Sudan, the problem is when you kick off any operation like this, any sort of disturbance to this level, you cannot predict the second and third order effects, how this plays out. And the problem is, again, going back to the lack of institutions and offices, particularly on the USG side, that were assigned to do this, it's a perfect storm. The one thing, that's where it's bad, and it could go real bad. And there's so much money involved because of the resources, the curse of resources. It could go real bad. So put a pin in that. There's also opportunity. Okay. And what I would tell you here is that the U.S. has not packaged its foreign policy with a lot of demand signal in mind for host nations. We have fed them exactly what we have wanted them to eat for a long time. And couch however they want it, and they were so grateful for the money. And then it wasn't coming from the Chinese and the Russians. They were like, okay, but man, at the end of the day, I mean, I did USAID Afghanistan, for God's sake. I've been shot at and blown up with that damn patch on me. I will love them forever. But for God's sake, there wasn't enough technical delivery that was really feeding people and making everybody know the actual delivery of America. And I think that's where now the lack of delivery on whatever the presumptive democracy, capitalism, all that shit. Now everybody gets to redefine it in their own ways. I'm seeing it in the Philippines. I'm seeing it in Libya, around all these common pool resources that we all got to figure out how to govern. We're going to see that in Venezuela. The one thing that I will tell you, and this is the opportunity, and this is a very radical idea, but it's getting traction, is that, and I would offer this, the only way that we get this right when the resources are such an enormous problem is that we stop acting like this is a bug of the system and build the system around these resources being the feature, and thinking about how do we get everybody a transparent cut, including all of these formal and informal actors. Like so much of the curse of resources has been around communities, countries never actually seeing roads, schools, health clinics come in. It's always elite capture. It's always corruption. It's always traditional mining companies out of the West, out of the East, out of Beijing, out of Boulder, Colorado. Like we promise a lot, we grossly underdeliver, and then we wonder why everybody wants to, readjust the system. I think we got to come in and deal honestly. And quite frankly, I think we use these resources to show people how we can give a better and just a square deal. Getting all the actors to agree to that, that's the hard part.
Justin, I think it would be interesting to hear you speak to your experience engaging with the military as they try to take on some of the responsibilities, to try to fill some of the transition stabilization gaps that were left by state and aid, and what
Uh,
that will mean for Venezuela.
Sure, but I want to make sure I catch this and throw it over because, especially, I know Joe's got a lot of military interlocution. I started my career in Army Special Operations, and a couple things. They are not remotely ready to catch the work that's coming their way. What I will also tell you is that you have so many career professionals that are going to do their absolute best, and they are doing it right now. And I can tell you a lot of them are in special operations community. I talk to them every day, and they are trying their best. What I think we'll see in the industry is there will be a lot more weird contracts coming out for DoD to figure out how to bring the real technical professionals in. It's going to be hard. Their contracting mechanisms are not going to be set up to do it. But I will tell you, having been both on the operator side, and if you know much about my experience in uniform, I believe that if I had had an actual USAID, an actual State Department person, an actual NGO person on the ground with me, we would have saved lives. Period. Full stop. And it's why I've always, wanted to get that civil space right. But they are overwhelmed. They don't have the policy to really direct what they want to do. There are some great leaders at the COCOM, and TSOC levels that are really doing their best, but it is rough. It is rough.
Joe, did you want to say anything about that? I'm sorry, I should have gone to you.
No, that's fine. I think Just got it, and I don't have any specific insight on that. I think historically, the issue on this is there has been poor trust and communications between those different actors that probably doesn't exist anymore because some of those actors don't exist anymore. And so, while DoD doesn't have I think the tools to approach this, they've always been open to new ways of doing things. And frankly, there are folks who probably would be happy to work with them to do that previously would not have, because the reality now is there is no USAID. There is no development that's separate from these other actors. And so I think you might see more of that than you would have seen previously in terms of sharing.
David Mandel, Anthony, go ahead.
I'll just put the very flat point on it about the State Department that, any expertise in offices at the State Department have been surgically removed that deal with stabilization, conflict prevention, atrocity prevention, accountability, even rule of law more broadly. INL is, I'm not even sure, a pale shadow of itself. And so we just have to, I think, just be realistic that's gone. State Department is not going to be a much of a player at all because the expertise is all gone. And I would argue even though like some of the political bureaus that incorporated lessons from the functional side of the house over the past 25 years are probably very reluctant to raise their hand in a meeting and say, actually, these are the lessons we learned from the offices that worked on these issues, even though those offices are no longer here, simply because the signal from the political leadership of the State Department has been clear that those perspectives are considered extraneous to U.S. foreign policy goals and therefore not welcome.
Amanda, I know you had experience. Oh, go ahead, Ambassador Johnson.
So one thing we haven't talked about here, which I think is at least worth throwing up, is that traditionally the Department of Defense has seen the development community and the rest of the diplomatic organization as their exit strategy. And so far we've heard nothing out of DoD about how they're going to wrap this project up. But as you know, sure as God made little green apples, they're going to get tired of this pretty quick because this is not what they see as their main reason for getting up in the morning. And so that's going to have a consequence as well, both within the Pentagon and as they inevitably try to start offloading this stuff and they don't have any place to offload it to. It's going to have some really unpredictable results, only predictable in the fact that we will have this problem.
Amanda, did you want to weigh in on that as well? I know you had the perspective of working in state on Venezuela.
I would just say, from my perspective, I think it's really important to just get good information on the ground. Like, I think that for a long time, we would only hear one side of the political spectrum in Venezuela. And I think that really we should prioritize trying to hear all voices on the ground, civil society voices as well, and try to just get the intel that we need to, in my view, guide Venezuela to a political transition so that we get to free and fair elections. And I think that I know that's not the goal as stated right now. I know, but Marco Rubio has talked about that. And I think we need to be moving quickly there and having good intel on the ground. And I mean from agency, but also just from State Department, from good political officers who are out there talking to the people. I think that's going to be really helpful. And I hope that that's happening.
I'd be curious to hear your perspective on that, Joe, because I think a lot USAID was also a major source of information in those engagements that you were talking about, or support even that we provided to civil society.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And Amanda and I were in the same embassy. USA did not have a mission on the ground, and so was located in the embassy, although at a couple of different years there, a couple of years apart. But it hadn't changed. The TV in the embassy was always on the channel that showed the opposition news when that was still possible, which changed after a while. And a lot of the folks that the USG would regularly interact with were out of touch with different sectors of the population and didn't accurately represent the actual support that was there for the project that was ongoing under the Chavez regime. And so I think, and it's not to say USA, this is not one of those, hey, and USA knew it. And state, and we all have our old pride in our own institutions. I think it was one of those things where state had and the larger USG presence had the ability to access many more potential partners because of the programming USAID was doing. So not to say that gave them, better information or anything else. It just created an environment where you might hear some more of these views. The human rights community in Venezuela, in the beginning of the Chavez regime, there were organizations that were very happy with the changes that had happened and were very felt that a progressive move forward that took into account the social and cultural rights and economic rights of people was something that was going to ultimately be beneficial for Venezuela. And they didn't want to work with USAID, and over time, bridges were built based on trust, and you started to get that perspective into these activities. And I think that was really important and something that helped, USAID and the US government writ large do a better job of understanding what was happening on the ground. That's going to have to happen again. It's really interesting, like others have said. The response to what happened on January 3rd, I mean, it's been fairly positive on the ground and but sort of pensive, right? Like what will come next? And I think a lot of these steps in terms of engaging those folks, you're going to miss an opportunity unless you do it quickly. There are people on the ground, and this isn't, it's interesting to me when they said that Maria Corina, I mean, she won an election. I mean, there's no doubt on a popular level. I think she would win another election tomorrow. What she didn't have legitimacy with was the security apparatus. And I think the real question was, how do you find someone who will make sure they do not become a spoiler in the process? And I don't think that the opposition was able to give the right answers on that because they've just been so isolated from that sector. And so I do think, you're going to have an evolving understanding of what's going to happen on the ground as the embassy grows. And I think they should take advantage of the different actors in civil society to really understand what's happening on the ground.
When you said that the embassy was often engaging with civil society leaders who did not represent broad popular opinion, to what would you attribute that?
There's probably a lot of historically, these were folks who had much more of a connection to the US government.
Mm.
Two, there was a self-selection. Like I said, there were a lot of people who supported. It was, it's hard to remember the left-right dynamic that existed and the Cuba sort of US rivalry in Latin America and what Venezuela as it evolved played in that process because it seems pretty irrelevant now, right? Like in a lot of ways, that's not a reflection of the current government or foreign policy structures on either side. But at the time, there was an incredible level of distrust. And I think a lot of people self-selected did not talk to the US government. And that includes USAID. They just didn't do it because of previous actions or perceived actions before that. So I think that contributed to it as well. I think also, a lot of times we like to find people who tell us what we want to hear, right? And I think a lot of the US government policy at the time was we wanted to hear that Chavez wasn't popular, that this wasn't some big movement and that this was a bunch of grifters stealing from the oil wealth on top, and they were going to disappear pretty soon. And there were a lot of people who were willing to give that message.
Amanda, go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, yes, one of the years that I was in Caracas, I spent trying to get a meeting with Maduro and did finally. But he did not want to speak to Americans. He did not want to be seen as speaking to Americans because that was, because of exactly the dynamic that Joe just laid out for us. And I think it is hard to remember. I think that, again, it goes back to this, like, if we are going to move toward like a democratic transition in Venezuela, we're going to need to reach out to those who are still ardent supporters of Chavismo. They do exist, of course. And then those who are in the political opposition as well. I think a role that the US government could potentially play also with our allies in Latin America and Europe. Hopefully, they're still our allies, but I think is to bring the parties to the table to lay out that roadmap. So get back to like the mesa de diálogo that we had started many years ago. I think it's time to restart that and to engage as diplomats, bringing people to the table to negotiate forward to a timetable and free and fair elections. Have I said that enough? I think I've said free and fair elections like at least 10 times.
You've
But that's
mentioned
what I
this,
would really like to see.
you've mentioned that Secretary Rubio has talked about elections, but how much credence do you give to that? Do you think that the US will really push for elections? Or will they be, elections?
I mean, I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that Rubio remembers that he was once very supportive of democratic institutions, not just here, but in all of Latin America and globally. So I hope that we do earnestly push for elections and help support the Venezuelan people to get there. I don't know that will happen, but that's where our own civil society, right? We have a role to play here as saying like, this is important to us. And this is important, this is where the Latin American community, the international community can bring pressure as well to try to help usher in. This is like players like the OAS or the UN. I mean, there are other players that I know that members of the Trump administration would like to sideline, but they are still important voices in Latin America. And I hope that they come forward as well to get Venezuela onto that path toward free and fair elections.
That feels like a good place to stop and ask a closing question. So this is for everybody, or for each of you, I suppose. If you had to name one assumption that US policymakers should discard before contemplating intervention, what is it? Go ahead, Angelique.
I'm not answering the question. I have the next question.
All good. Go ahead, Justin.
I have a simple response.
Yeah.
This is way harder and going to take way longer than anybody is talking about right now.
I heartily agree with that.
I'll go next in that spirit. I think the assumption to discard is that we can manage this transition simply because American power guarantees our preferred outcomes. And that's rooted in hubris, the same hubris that has bedeviled American-led interventions for the past decades, that our power equals control for all these factors that are going to drive instability. Yeah, I would leave it at that. And yeah.
How about you, Ambassador Johnson?
The same assumption that every diplomat has to remind himself of every single day, and that is you assume that they are just like us and they will respond the same way we think we would in a similar circumstance. And they're not, they're them. And you have to figure out what the them is and how they're going to react to your policy choices and not impose your own preconception on that.
How about yourself, Amanda?
I mean, echoing what others have said, I do think that I would say we need to drop this idea that we can just work unilaterally. Just because we snap our fingers and say this is what we want doesn't mean that it's going to happen in Venezuela or anywhere else in the world. That I think we are best when we work multilaterally with our allies towards our objectives. I think it makes it legitimizes our efforts and creates the conditions for success. And don't get me wrong, I want success here. I want this policy to be successful for the Venezuelan people and for us, our US interests. I hope that it does succeed. I think we've laid out a lot of potential risks, but maybe this is a moment where we can start to look to some of our other partners to start working multilaterally to again create the conditions for success. There are lots of other actors out there. We haven't talked much about China and Russia and others in the region, Brazil. I mean, there are big players, Mexico that have, and Colombia, of course, that have like major interests here. And I think that, we need to think more strategically and multilaterally, not just unilaterally.
Joe, how about you?
It's always great to go last on a question like that where other intelligent people have come up with most of the answers. I think, to me, the assumption that we know more than we know is tied directly to what the ambassador said, to what David said about control, power equaling control. We just should be very humble about what we know about these locations and the depth of that knowledge, because there are movements and relationships and motivations that are going to drive these things that to us on the surface or coming from the outside may look perfectly aligned with what we want to happen, that may end up with drastically different results. And so I think the constant, Justin mentioned earlier, the feedback loops and creating an understanding start from there, not from what we know, but what we can possibly learn, I think would be a better way to look at it.
Angelique, did you want to ask the first Q&A question?
I was going to, and then Amanda actually kind of tackled it in what she just said a moment ago. I was going to ask about other external actors, so you touched on that. And I also see that there are a lot of, questions in the chat. So I am going to hand over my time to some of the questions that we've got in the chat.
Okay, great. I will take anonymous attendee number 1, very mysterious. Now that it's increasingly clear the Venezuelan operation was not primarily about narco-terrorism, is there any visibility into how the U.S. military views its role? Specifically, are there concerns within the ranks about being asked to risk lives and safety in service of oil interests or private financial benefit, rather than a clearly articulated national security mission on behalf of the U.S. government? That's a good one. I will give it to Justin, having served, unless anyone's raising their hand.
JAG officers, S3s, like you see people kind of putting in place the type of bureaucratic safeguards that need to be there, but everybody kind of trusts happens. But if you've ever worked in one of these types of downrange applications, these things happen when there isn't good governance and control. And I think that's what we're really seeing. There's a lack of governance and control at the top, really in terms of policy, some of the new leadership that's come in. But what I would also offer here is if you are seeing much more restraint on the military side, that's not accidental. I think that's deliberate. I think that's real professionals trying to keep the leash absolutely as tight as they can. But I would say we're going to see a few more mistakes.
You're on mute, but I think you called on me. I'd say, because I don't have any specific insights. I haven't been hanging out at the bars near Fort Bragg or anything like that. But the first crack you should expect would be in the Coast Guard because of their particular way they see their mission. And the second observation I'd make is the administration is tried very hard, and I think it's been somewhat successful in creating some legal ambiguity about its attacks on vessels on the water. Attacks on airplanes are a totally different thing. The black letter law there is extraordinarily clear, and it's a violation of not just international law, but U.S. domestic law. And so that step, and those of us who are old will recall when the so-called narco airplane was shot down in Peru, and it turned out to be a family of American missionaries. So these things can go south in a hurry in really ugly ways. And I would urge caution because of that very fact. Thank you.
Could you say a little bit more about what you meant about the Coast Guard, the role that they're playing, and why that would be a pain point?
Well, the Coast Guard is only part of the military, quote unquote, in time of war. And they're sometimes brought on U.S. naval vessels because of their specific expertise as boarding parties. And so they're not integrated into this completely, but they're integrated into it partially. They see their mission as protecting life. They're the guys who go out and risk their own lives to pick up people who got caught in storms or were foolish boaters or whatever. And so that's just the way they see their life. They are more of a police service than they are of a military service. And so this is going to affect the way they see their role in life a little bit differently than it will the other uniformed services. Thank you.
All right, I'll go to the next question. We've got a question from Brian Hopt. Are there any historic parallels for the administration's decision to hold Venezuela's oil money in an account in Qatar? What do we know about who in the administration will manage it and how it will be managed? And how do you think it will ever be managed by Congress? I'm wondering if there are parallels to the Afghanistan's reserves, but yeah, don't everyone volunteer at once. Maybe
I
that we
have
don't have
no
the
idea. I think it's a great question. I have no idea. I saw a press that said that the initial money from the money from the initial sale of the oil has gone back to Venezuela, but it's I feel like this is less than transparent.
I, I also am not an expert, but I would go back to Amanda's broader point to urge the administration not to completely discount the value of multilateralist frameworks when it comes to managing problem sets. And there have been multilateral solutions to dealing with frozen assets of former regimes, to dealing with, payments out of sanctioned accounts. And there have been whole claims commissions set up, to deal with claims about, illegally expropriated revenues, right? So, but all of those have primarily gone through international law and been set up multilaterally to boost the legitimacy and the credibility of those initiatives. And if we were inclined, we could probably look to some of those as models for how to do this. But I am not an expert.
Joe, go
Yeah,
ahead.
again, I'd have to agree. I don't know about a specific historical parallel. I will say again, based on the Treasury Secretary's testimony yesterday under when he was at a complete loss to explain the legal authority, the statutory authority under which they would be doing this, both holding and then spending the money, and what systems were in place for tracking as requests from the Venezuelan government came in for budget. There were no answers. And that's not to say they don't exist, but as far as we know on the outside, based on that testimony, the office that is supposed to be in charge of those funds did not give any answers related to that. I will say from folks that I've spoken to in Venezuela, there's a lot of cynicism. This is a regime that over the last 20 years, a lot of money has disappeared into a lot of the private accounts of folks who are still very much central to this post-transition government. And so I think there is not a lot of faith right now in the process in Venezuela that this funding will be used in an equitable way. And I think that's something to watch on the horizon here, because it would be a great area for some PR wins on this process if there were ways to figure out how to engage the Venezuelan people in that process. But I haven't seen that, and I don't see many folks on the ground who think that's coming in the short term.
Go.
Okay, want to jump in with a question here. We all have talked a little bit about how this intervention doesn't really feel like it's about narco trafficking for a variety of reasons, but narco trafficking is still an actual issue for the region. So what happens after this? Let's say either, as we're just discussing now, we don't know what happens to the finances, the money gets messy. What happens if this enables narco trafficking? Do you think that there are any implications for the broader region based on what happens here in Venezuela? For anyone.
So I'd make a couple of observations. One is that to the extent it is Venezuelan trafficking, it's not a risk for the United States, at least not a significant one. Almost all of the cocaine that comes to the United States comes from Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, up the Pacific side, through Central America into Mexico and so forth. This is almost all of the product that's exiting Venezuela and Brazil is destined for mostly for Europe via Africa, some of it to Australia and to East Asia. But I think the bigger issue is like the bigger security question we were talking about earlier. If narco trafficking is not addressed and it erodes the competency of the state to provide a safe environment for its own people, that's where the big risk is for Venezuelan stability and likely for broader stability in the region as well.
I would just add, relatedly, I think the issue of narco terrorism and the pretext with which we went in to extract Maduro, right? I think that framework is still a potential for elsewhere in the region, right? I think that, Claudia Sheinbaum in Mexico woke up the next day and thought, oh, wow, are we going to see U.S. forces or the use of force in Mexico against our cartels, which have also been designated as foreign terrorist organizations under the Trump administration. So I think that there are a lot of implications in terms of like counter-narcotics and this new term of narco-terrorism that have implications for the region and that I think could potentially be destabilizing.
I think that's a really interesting point, and I think that's a great place to stop and to use as a jumping off point to encourage folks to join us next time, because I wanted to ask about Mexico and Cuba and didn't want to distract us from the purpose of this one. I would love to see, or I will look forward to the discussion of that next time.
Yeah, Jordan, thank you so much for moderating the session, and thank you to all of the panelists. I don't want to jump on your toes, Jordan.
I'm good.
We're coming to a close here, and as Jordan said, I think this is a really great opportunity to just remind those folks on the call. This is part of a series, so save the date for February 20th. We'll have more information about that coming soon. The next session in this Venezuela series will take a much deeper dive into the regional geopolitics, so we'll be able to dig into the questions of not just Venezuela, but also broader regional questions as well. And then the third session, which will be later in February or earlier in March, will focus specifically on the legal frameworks involved in these conversations. So we'll be able to address some of those. Yes, Amanda, let's talk about Cuba for sure. I am looking forward to putting you on the spot on that. Amanda will be joining us for this next session as well. And so that final session, we'll have an opportunity to also think about what some of those legal issues are as well that we touched upon today. I think they get really interesting. So again, thanks so much for coming. Look out for our message and invitation to the next session. Thank you so much to each and every one of your panelists today for sharing your expertise with us. I'm really, really grateful. There are moments that reminded me, not in great ways, of taking me back to the early days of Afghanistan and Iraq, but also I think this is the value of having a group like this of folks who draw many years of experience from working these issues on the ground in a variety of roles across the USG and external. And that value is what we hope to continue to be able to bring to this community. And thank you finally to Jordan for agreeing to moderate this panel discussion, which was meaty to say the least. Very much appreciate all of you.
See you guys next time.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.